A faint whisper of conspiracy drifted through the corridors of power, a shadow in the heart of Burkina Faso. For years, whispers had grown into murmurs, murmurs into rumors, until finally, a name surfaced. A secretive network orchestrating one of the most extensive gold smuggling operations in West Africa. But what made this web truly terrifying was not its scale. It was the people behind it. Former high-ranking officials, ex-ministers, once respected and now revealed as architects of betrayal. Just as silence threatened to swallow justice, a storm rose, its name Ibrahim Traoré. But before we dive into this gripping tale of betrayal, power and redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Stories like these deserve to be known, and your support brings them to life. Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasn't born a savior. He was shaped by fire, molded by duty. A young officer with clear eyes and a quiet intensity, he had witnessed the crumbling of public trust firsthand. Corruption wasn't just an enemy, it was a disease infecting the soul of his homeland. When he ascended to power amidst a tide of political unrest, many doubted his strength, questioned his motives. But Traoré was not a man who spoke in promises. He moved in actions. Early into his leadership, intelligence reports reached his desk. Unusual movements of gold, missing customs documentation, encrypted communications linking current market fluctuations to unaccounted shipments. On the surface, it looked like mere smuggling. But the deeper he and his team delved, the clearer the horror became. This was not the work of petty criminals or desperate opportunists. It was structured, protected, deeply embedded, and shockingly familiar names kept appearing in the shadows. Among them were individuals once seen shaking hands at official ceremonies, posing beside dignitaries, speaking of national progress. They weren't rogue agents, they were insiders, former cabinet members, military advisors, diplomats. Their influence had carved passageways through border controls, customs, and financial systems. They operated with impunity, believing themselves untouchable. For Traoré, this wasn't just about gold. It was about dignity, about tearing out the roots of a rotted system and planting something new. He ordered covert surveillance, froze questionable accounts, and summoned a core investigative unit loyal only to the people. Every meeting was tense, every step laced with danger, but with each thread pulled, more of the web unraveled. Inside dusty archives hidden among bureaucratic clutter, his team found coded memos, transactions masked as infrastructure investments signed by ghost companies. Courier logs showed private jets arriving at odd hours, departing heavy, bound for nations with lax import scrutiny. Traoré didn't need a court to know the truth. He saw it in the desperation of those suddenly resigning, fleeing, denying. But he also saw something else, a flicker of hope. Word of the investigation began to circulate. At first, the reaction was disbelief, then fear. But soon something rarer emerged, courage. A former customs officer came forward with testimony. A miner from the east, whose village had been ravaged by illegal extractions, sent a letter. Piece by piece, puzzle by puzzle, the image became undeniable. Still, Traoré knew this was only the beginning. To challenge such a deeply rooted network would mean facing enemies with power, influence, and no shortage of resources. But he had already made his choice. The line had been drawn. The question wasn't whether he would succeed, it was how far he would go. The nation watched in silence, holding its breath. Justice, it seemed, was finally on the move. The air grew heavier in Ouagadougou as Captain Traoré pressed forward with his investigation. Whispers turned to warnings. Phone lines went silent. Friendly faces averted their eyes. Those who once cheered his rise now questioned their safety. But retreat was not in Traoré's nature. The special unit he formed, nicknamed Le Bouclier, the Shield, operated with surgical precision. Its members were carefully selected for their integrity, trained to move silently, ask the right questions, and follow trails invisible to the untrained eye. What they discovered confirmed the captain's worst fears. A retired customs director, once lauded for his reforms, had falsified hundreds of clearance documents. Gold shipments declared at a fraction of their true value vanished across borders, only to reappear in foreign markets as private exports. Offshore accounts tied to former ministers showed staggering sums, often in currencies never used within Burkina Faso. Each new detail painted a picture of betrayal too vast to fully comprehend, but every breakthrough came with a cost. Anonymous threats flooded in. One morning, Traoré's lead investigator found his home ransacked. Another team member reported being followed for days. A journalist who had collaborated on background research went missing for nearly 48 hours. The message was clear. The network wasn't just large, it was still alive and it was watching. Even within government walls, doubts stirred. Some advisors urged caution, suggesting that stability was more important than justice. But Traoré remained unshaken. To him, stability built on silence was nothing more than a lie waiting to collapse. In the face of mounting pressure, a moment of unexpected courage ignited hope. A mid-level accountant, quiet, meticulous, walked into the Ministry of Finance one morning with a sealed folder. His name was Adama Ouedraogo. He requested to speak directly with Traoré. Inside the folder were transaction records linking elite officials to private mining firms. Some signatures belonged to men who had stood beside the president at national ceremonies. Others were of foreign intermediaries, operating under diplomatic protection. Adama's testimony was clear and precise. He had noticed discrepancies for years, but feared for his life. What gave him strength now? He looked Traoré in the eyes and said, "Because for once, someone is fighting back." His statement emboldened others. A young soldier came forward with photographs of secret airstrips near the eastern border. A former aide confessed to shredding reports on illegal excavations. Suddenly, the silence that had shielded the corrupt for years began to fracture. Still, the captain knew testimony alone wasn't enough. The public needed proof. Undeniable, documented truth. With new momentum, Traoré authorized a discreet audit of past export records, working with trusted international partners. Documents long buried in bureaucratic limbo began to surface. Late one evening, his team uncovered a contract between a decommissioned military officer and a logistics firm notorious for transporting special cargo. The destination? A warehouse in a neighboring country, registered under a shell company. The implications were staggering, but confirmation would require patience and absolute secrecy. Meanwhile, the people of Burkina Faso followed every revelation with growing anticipation. In markets and mosques, in universities and roadside cafes, citizens debated what it all meant. Some feared the blowback, others whispered of hope. For the first time in years, the idea that truth could triumph began to feel real. But Traoré knew better than to celebrate early. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the terrain became, and those being exposed would not go down without a fight. Still, the momentum was real, and the truth had begun its march. The silence before the storm had passed. The investigation, once confined to quiet whispers and concealed evidence, now spilled into the open. Arrests began. In the dead of night, armored vehicles rolled through quiet neighborhoods. Former officials, long considered untouchable, were escorted away in handcuffs. For many, it was surreal. Names once respected, now associated with treachery. But the operation was not without resistance. The first counterstrike came subtly. A government document, freshly forged, attempted to discredit Adama Ouedraogo's testimony. Leaks began appearing in foreign media, painting Traoré's actions as politically motivated. Anonymous press releases claimed the accused were victims of a witch hunt. It was a coordinated effort, calculated, expensive, and undeniably desperate. Traoré stood firm. He addressed the nation directly, eyes unwavering, voice clear. This is not about revenge. This is about justice. If we are to rebuild trust, no one can be above the law. The public, electrified by his resolve, poured into the streets in peaceful demonstrations of support. Handmade posters bore messages of solidarity. Chants echoed through the capital. For a country long haunted by disillusionment, the scent of change was tangible. Still, the deeper problem remained. The rot was systemic. Even as arrests mounted, Traoré faced a crisis of principle. Among those implicated were mentors, comrades from his early days in uniform, men he once admired. Loyalty, once so clearly defined, now clashed with responsibility. One evening he sat alone in the presidential residence, holding a photograph of his first commanding officer, now awaiting trial. The past, it seemed, had left him with ghosts. He did not break. Instead, he acted. Reforms were introduced with urgency and care. High-level appointments were temporarily suspended pending review. A whistleblower protection program was launched. Public finance records were opened for scrutiny. For Traoré, it wasn't enough to punish the guilty. He had to ensure the system could not be hijacked again. Meanwhile, Le Bouclier traced the logistics chain behind the smuggling network. Using intercepted communications, they discovered a series of encrypted messages linking several transactions to a private airport in a remote part of the country. Satellite images confirmed unusual flight patterns, and one name kept resurfacing: Idriss Sanou, a former military contractor turned international broker. Sanou had not been seen publicly in years, but his influence lingered. Traoré's team suspected he had acted as the liaison between domestic operators and foreign buyers. A warrant was issued. Border alerts were activated. But Sanou, if alive, remained elusive. Inside the capital, the arrest of a former vice minister ignited outrage among the accused's loyalists. Tensions flared in certain districts, and Traoré deployed community mediators to prevent escalation. He refused to answer violence with violence. His message was simple: transparency, not tyranny. What followed was one of the boldest moves of his tenure. He called for an open parliamentary inquiry, inviting independent observers and journalists. Critics labeled it a political stunt. Supporters called it revolutionary. But Traoré knew the truth. Sunlight was the only antidote to the darkness. The sessions revealed layers of deceit, hidden alliances, and years of misappropriated wealth. The names, the dates, the documents, it all became public record. The veil was lifted. Across the nation, people watched in rapt attention. Hope, once fractured, now flickered bright. Still, no one could deny the danger ahead. Enemies were cornered, desperate. But so was the country, desperate for a future that didn't look like its past. And Ibrahim Traoré, though tired, remained unshaken. The reckoning had begun. With the smuggling ring exposed and its leadership crumbling, Ibrahim Traoré faced a daunting new phase: restoration. The flames of corruption had scorched institutions far beyond the Ministry of Finance or border control. They had reached into the courts, local governance, the military. Cleaning house was not enough. He had to rebuild it. The first steps were structural. Ministries implicated in the network were placed under temporary oversight. New ethics committees were formed, composed of legal scholars, civil society leaders, and auditors. Transparency became the cornerstone of every policy. Every contract over a certain threshold was now made public. Every senior appointment required independent review. These were not gestures. They were shields designed to prevent future abuse. But Traoré understood that reform wasn't only about laws and systems, it was about healing. He toured cities and villages, meeting with community elders, workers, and students. He listened, not as a leader above reproach, but as a man willing to bear the anger, the sorrow, and the questions of a wounded people. They asked how such betrayal had gone unnoticed. They demanded justice, but also guarantees. He gave them what he could: honesty and accountability. Educational initiatives were launched in partnership with local NGOs, teaching the values of civic duty, ethics, and national responsibility from a young age. Schools became centers not just of learning, but of rebuilding trust. International observers, initially skeptical, began to shift their tone. Reports praised the transparency of the investigations and the inclusiveness of the reforms. Foreign investment talks resumed, not with the usual backroom deals, but with public forums and local consultations. In a landmark decision, Traoré offered legal pathways for citizens to reclaim stolen assets. Through anonymous reporting programs, several hidden gold stashes and offshore accounts were identified. A large portion of the recovered wealth was reinvested into public infrastructure, clinics, water systems, and schools, prioritized in areas most affected by illegal mining. Perhaps most symbolically, a national day of remembrance was established to honor those who had resisted corruption. Journalists, whistleblowers, civil servants who had lost careers or lives in pursuit of truth. Their names were spoken aloud in ceremonies across the country, no longer forgotten. And yet, even as hope blossomed, vigilance remained essential. Traoré knew that networks of corruption, once dismantled, often reappear in new forms. That knowledge drove the creation of the High Council for Public Integrity, an independent body with investigative powers, answerable only to the public through regular reports. Its members rotated every 2 years, preventing political entrenchment. Simultaneously, a digital platform was introduced, allowing any citizen to report suspicious activity anonymously. It was simple, accessible by phone, and monitored in real time. Within weeks, it had already triggered inquiries into mismanagement in local administrations. Resistance did not disappear entirely. A small group of former elites attempted to rally opposition abroad, seeking to undermine the legitimacy of the reforms. But the voice of the people was louder, and it was resolute. In every market, in every mosque and church, in classrooms and cafes, the conversations had changed. People debated policy, questioned officials, demanded explanations. It was a fragile but extraordinary shift. Democracy not as an event, but as a habit, daily practiced, lived. Traoré, once a quiet officer with a fierce gaze, had become a symbol of ethical leadership. But he never claimed victory. Instead, he reminded his nation, "This is not an end. This is the beginning of the country we deserve." And across the land, those words echoed. Years from now, historians may point to a specific moment when Burkina Faso changed course. But for those who lived through it, the transformation was not a sudden wave. It was a steady tide, pulled forward by the quiet determination of one man, Ibrahim Traoré. His story had begun with suspicion, grown into defiance, and matured into a blueprint for national integrity. What had once been a nation strangled by invisible chains now stood on firmer ground. Bruised, yes, but no longer broken. Traoré's final act in the long war against corruption was perhaps the most powerful. He stepped back. After years of leadership, marked by decisive action, transparency, and tireless reform, he initiated a national dialogue on democratic succession. He invited opposition leaders, civil society, and youth representatives to draft a new electoral framework, one immune to manipulation, one rooted in collective ownership. He stated publicly, "Power should never be a destination. It must be a responsibility, borrowed, never possessed." His words shook even his critics, and when the time came, he announced he would not seek an extended mandate. His legacy, he said, should not rest in the length of his rule, but in the depth of his country's renewal. That decision sealed his place in the hearts of millions. From the bustling streets of Bobo Dioulasso to the dry plains of the Sahel, his name became a symbol, not of perfection but of possibility. Children in classrooms wrote essays about leadership. Artists painted murals of resistance and justice. Farmers, teachers, drivers, everyone had their own story of how things had changed. Yet Traoré himself refused to be idealized. In a rare interview, he spoke simply, "I was one man, but I stood with many. What we achieved together." The rebuilt institutions continued to hold. The watchdog bodies he had created uncovered new irregularities, but this time justice came swiftly. No more silence, no more hidden deals. The system was working, not flawlessly, but earnestly. Internationally, Burkina Faso was no longer a footnote in the global gold trade scandal. It was a case study in national reform. Delegations arrived to study its model. Partnerships were forged on the basis of mutual respect. No longer begging for aid, the nation negotiated as an equal. But the true change was internal. The people now expected honesty. They questioned decisions. They participated in governance. The fear that once muzzled voices had been replaced by responsibility. Democracy had found a deeper rhythm, not just in elections, but in everyday life. Traoré, having handed over leadership, chose to work quietly as an advisor on governance in West Africa. He remained accessible but distant, never overshadowing his successor, never clinging to power. His presence reminded the nation that leadership was not a throne, but a role to be served and surrendered. And so his legacy endured, not in statues, but in systems. Not in slogans, but in schools, roads, and institutions that outlasted him. His was a legacy written not in gold, but in grit. As the sun set on one era and rose on another, the people of Burkina Faso walked forward, not behind a savior, but beside one another. Their story, like Traoré's, was still being written. If this journey inspired you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, justice, and transformation that shape our world. And don't forget, click on the suggested video now appearing on your screen. Another remarkable tale of integrity awaits.